Welcome back to our study in the book of Acts. We're looking at Acts chapter 27, and Paul begins his journey towards Rome. Paul survived the murderous plots of the Jews in Palestine. Will he escape them just to go and be killed in Rome? What will happen to him on a long, dangerous sea voyage? When he stands before Caesar, what will happen? What will be the emperor's judgment? Perhaps we don't learn answers to all these questions. Let's continue to learn what we can. 27 verse 1 says, "It was decided that we should sail for Italy. An officer named Julius guarded Paul and other prisoners. Julius served in the emperor's regiment. The deciding was not by Festus in consequence of Paul's appeal to Caesar." When chapter 27 begins, all the plans and arrangements for the voyage to Rome have been completed and the time for sailing has been fixed. I have no way of knowing how long Paul was a prisoner in Caesarea after this appeal, but the time was probably not long. Paul had long wanted to go to Rome to preach. Jesus had appeared to Paul at night back during Paul's imprisonment in Jerusalem and told him he would testify at Rome. He's beginning his long anticipated trip to the capital of the empire, though not perhaps as he imagined some years before of how he would make that trip. We should sail for Italy. Here begins the longest "we" section in the book of Acts. Paul's arrest at the close of the third missionary journey had kept them somewhat apart through the intervening years, but now they are together again. It means Luke and Paul will spend time together. The account of Paul's voyage to Rome is like no other story in all the Bible. In it, the reader's attention is directed not to the spiritual truths and acts of devotion, but rather to such mundane things as ships and seas and winds and waves, islands, towns, and harbours. Altogether, Luke has given a description of first-century ships and seamanship, surpassing anything else in the extant Greek and Roman literature. It's a fascinating story of adventure. It stands also as a descriptive masterpiece. Its nautical descriptions are authentic to the last detail. Julius served in the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's special bodyguard. It might have been called the Augustan cohort. The Augustan cohort was a cohort of officer couriers. Came from the original work of administrating the grain supply for the empire. As time passed, their sphere of duties were enlarged. The emperor used them to go to various governors and provincial army leaders with personal messages and instructions. At some time, perhaps as early as Octavian's time, perhaps as late as Hadrian's, these officer couriers came to be called peregrini. We'll learn later there were 276 people on board the ship, including an unnumbered group of prisoners, probably also bound for Rome. All the prisoners were under the charge of Julius and his soldiers. It's possible that Julius accompanied Festus as the emperor's personal escort, as Festus went to his new province, and since Festus had been installed, Julius is now returning to Rome. Verse 2 says, "We went aboard a ship which was from the city of Adramyttium. It was ready to sail for ports along the coast of Asia. Then we set sail. Aristarchus went with us. He was a man from the city of Thessalonica in Macedonia." Adramyttium, the modern-day Edremit, was a lovely harbour on the coast of Mysia, opposite the island of Lesbos. It was an important shipbuilding centre in the first century, and probably was the ship's home port. Very likely this vessel was en route to our final stop before the long winter ahead set in and made sailing impossible. This language indicates the ship was a coasting vessel, which would stop at various ports along the way back towards Adramyttium. The ship would be sailed north into the Aegean Sea and not on west to Italy. Julius likely anticipated he would find a ship bound for Rome in one of these ports. Aristarchus, like Luke, had journeyed with Paul to Jerusalem when they brought the offering for the Jerusalem Christians. Aristarchus is travelling home to Thessalonica, and that he leaves the party after he reaches Myra, crosses the province of Asia until he can travel the Egnatian Way to Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration, allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Sidon was about 70 miles north of Caesarea. The voyage would easily be accomplished under favourable sailing weather in 24 hours. Probably this coasting vessel put in here to load or unload some cargo. Sidon was named in connection with Herod Agrippa I in Acts 12:20. The word translated consideration is philanthropes. It speaks for love for man. Paul was treated humanely, kindly. Julius' attitude was, "Can I make you comfortable?" Perhaps Julius had received orders from Festus or Agrippa to treat Paul courteously. At any rate, it seems that Paul received favours from Julius that the other prisoners did not receive. Luke says Paul went to his friends. There ought to be good reasons for having joy, comfort and peace when we meet other Christians, wherever they are in the world. There are a number of scriptures that reflect this. 2 Corinthians 1:1, we have a like precious faith. Jude 3, we have a wonderful gift of salvation in common. Romans 8, we are heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12:6, we are members of one another in the body of Christ. We have the same care for each other. We rejoice and mourn with each other. Thessalonians 5, we comfort and edify each other. Hebrews 10:24, we provoke each other unto love and good works. Colossians 2, our hearts are tied together in love. That love is the kind of love that Jesus has for us. It ought to be the kind of love that motivates us to lay down our lives for each other. Paul had many more friends than enemies wherever he went. By the time he travelled around the eastern half of the Roman Empire, he has had a hand in establishing many congregations. His fellow workers, those he trained and are preaching and teaching all over Syria, Phoenicia, Asia Minor, Macedonia and Greece. He knows many of the Christians in Rome. In fact, many of them are his relatives, as you'll learn from the 16th chapter of Romans. From Sidon, Paul is taken by ship to Myra. There Paul and other prisoners are taken to an Alexandrian ship, which is heading for Italy. The ship remained at anchor in the port of Sidon long enough to transact her business. The ship then headed north after leaving the harbour at Sidon. At some other time of the year, when the prevailing winds blew from a different direction, they might have sailed directly from Sidon to Mysia, leaving Cyprus on the right, just as Paul had done on an earlier voyage from Patara to Tyre. During this time of year, it was getting late in the sailing season, the prevailing winds, called the Etesian winds, blow from west and northwest. Thus, once they have passed the island of Cyprus, there is a stretch of open sea to be crossed between Cyprus and the southern coast of Cilicia. The Adramatian ship crept from point to point up the coast, taking advantage of every opportunity to make a few miles, and lying at anchor when the westerly wind made progress impossible, Ramsay says. We landed at Myra in Lycia. Lycia was a province in the southwestern part of Asia Minor. Pamphylia was on its eastern boundary. Caria Asia was on its western side. Phrygia and Pisidia lay on the north. The city of Myra, situated on the river Andricus, lay some 2 miles inland from its harbour, Andricia. The city stood on a hill where two valleys met. Its harbour grew in importance once the Roman grain ships started sailing across the Mediterranean. The Western text gives 15 days as the time spent in sailing across the open sea from Cyprus to Myra, a very reasonable estimate if the ship had to hug the southeast of the Asia Minor for a good part of the voyage. Verse 6 says, here the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailed for Italy, and he put us aboard. At Myra, the first part of the voyage to Rome has been completed. About 300 years earlier, Egypt had become the bread basket of Rome. The grain grown in Egypt had to be shipped to Rome. A whole fleet of ships was devoted to this trade. The fleet being organised under the Department of State and thus directly responsible to the Roman government. The ship that was in port at Myra was on her way to Rome, and once her sailors had offered prayers to the deity that protected the voyage on the way towards Rome. They would weigh anchor and sail past Cnidus, and if possible take advantage of the shelter of numerous islands in the Aegean Sea and south of Greece until they could reach Sicily, and from thence sail to Puteoli. The Alexandrian ships were very large and were steered by two broad oars, one at each side of the stern. One large mast with a huge sail fastened to an enormous yard arm, Another sail was often seen in the forepart of the ship. One consequence of such a design is that in storms the strain was concentrated in a relatively small area, and the ships tended to spring leaks rather quickly, which is a bit stupid with grain ships. From a description of such ships found in ancient literature, it has been estimated they could carry between 10 and 1100 tons of grain. From Myra, Paul and other prisoners set sail for Snidus, arriving there after several days. The shoreline of the Asia Minor from Myra westward tends in a more northwesterly direction, and so the sailing was slow. They would have less shelter from the northwest wind than they had from the coastline on their voyage from off the coast of Cilicia to Myra. The many days may have been a fortnight or even 3 weeks. Myra Snidus was only 130 miles. Snidus was a harbour of the Korean peninsula called Tropium. To reach this place, they had coasted along Lycia and gone through the straits between Rhodes and the mainland. A look at the map will show that at Snidus the coast of Asia Minor trends away to the north. Once a ship passed Snidus, it would no longer have the shelter of the land. Instead, it was exposed to the full force of the Etesian winds. Under such adverse conditions, once they arrived off Snidus, they had to choose one of two alternatives. Snidus had 2 harbours. The ships could put into one of them and spend the winter, if there were still a few days left in the sailing season. They might wait in one of the harbours for wind that would allow them to sail through the islands till they arrived at Cytherea, an island off the southern east end of Greece, and then they could sail on towards Sicily and Rome. Johnson's note says that the winds from the northwest would have been broken up by the highlands of the island. He says the information about the travel is so accurate and detailed that it must have been written by an eyewitness. The other alternative was to attempt to continue the voyage by sailing in a southerly direction until they came under the shelter of the island of Crete. Then, by sailing along the southern shore of that island, they could gain another 100 miles towards Rome. By that time the winds will have changed and blown from a different direction that would permit the rest of the voyage to Rome. The second alternative is the choice of the sailors on this voyage. Salmone was a cape on the eastern end of Crete. After rounding this cape, they began sailing in a westerly direction. By this route they have avoided the open sea west of Snidus, but even after they had tried this tack in hopes the wind would change, they find that it doesn't. From Snidus, Paul's ship has a slow and difficult journey to Fair Havens. Snidus was to the northeast and Salmone to the eastern tip of the island of Crete was to the southwest. Then passing along the southern coast of the island, they came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. Fair Havens might have lived up to the promise of its name if the ship's owner and the centurion had listened to Paul and waited there until the weather was better for sailing. Verse 9 says, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them. Sailors on the Mediterranean called the days between September and 14th and November 11th as a dangerous season. It was a sail at your own risk period. They didn't sail unless absolutely necessary during this dangerous season. According to Philo in his Life of Moses, no prudent man went to sea after the fast. The fast was another name for the Jewish Day of Atonement. Luke is using Jewish time in his account of what Paul said, rather than speaking of the sailing which being the dangers from the Ides of November to the Ides of March. It is already October, and as they wait in the Bay of Fair Havens for a change of wind, they are right in the middle of the dangerous season for sailing. Verse 10, Paul says to them, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also our lives. Perhaps Paul speaks as an experienced sailor, or perhaps it's indicative of the respect in which he is held. Admonish is used in medical writers of the advice that a doctor gives to his patient. Any further sailing will cost of injury inflicted by the elements and loss of cargo, maybe even the ship, maybe even lives of the men on board. I perceive represents a result or experience and observation, not revelation. but the words came very near being fulfilled to the letter. Now in Acts we are left with the impression that God is turning the direction of Paul more and more to providence. In the earlier chapters, Paul was led by the Spirit and by visions. Now it seems more and more Paul is left to exercise his own good judgment. Verse 38 tells us the cargo of the ship was wheat. Paul had assurance that he was to preach at Rome, but he had not yet, down to this time, been assured of the safety of his fellow voyagers, so he's concerned about their safety. Paul is predicting doom for the ship and its passengers. God was merciful to all of them because Paul was among them. The harbour they're in may have its drawbacks, but they had best remain there, is Paul's advice. Verse 11, but the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than what was being said by Paul. The pilot was the helmsman or steersman, who occupied a conspicuous place in the stern of ancient ships and steered it and gave directions to the crew. The other term, captain or owner, of the supposition that the ship was merely leased to the state, the owner would not only own the ship but the cargo also. The centurion's conduct was quite natural. Who knows but that he gave thought to what would be said of him in Rome when it was learned that he followed the advice of a prisoner rather than a judgment of a pilot and owner of a vessel. Verse 12 says, because the harbour was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached the decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbour of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. The anchorage in fair heavens, while it gave immediate shelter from the northwest gales, was open to all the southern points of the compass, Smith says. It would put a strain on Lassia too to show hospitality to 276 people through the winter. The risk was admittedly great. The majority were by no means sure they could reach the harbour further up the coast. The harbour of Phoenix was far more sheltered than the one at Fair Havens. The nearby town would be better able to handle such a not large amount of people through the winter months. Verse 13 says, when a moderate south wind came up and supposing they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete close inshore. It was about 5 miles from Fair Havens to Cape Matala, about 35 miles from there to Phoenix. If the south wind lasted just 3 or 4 hours, they could sail the distance and put the ship in harbour for the winter. The tense of the Greek verb sailing implies they were in the act of doing this when a storm burst upon them, as related in the next verse. The adverb close inshore is comparative degree adverb. It tells us they were closer to the shore than usual for sailing this stretch of water. 14:15 says, but before very long there rushed down from the land a violent wind, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. After they rounded Cape Matala, suddenly the wind changed. Such sudden change of wind seemed to be a common occurrence in this area. A violent wind, the Greek says, a typhoon wind, out of the northeast sprang up and blew down upon them from Mount Ida. Rushed down from Mount Ida is exactly right, for the mountains of Greece are over 7,000 feet high. As they were trying to sail in northwesterly direction, this wind would have caught them almost broadside. It was so violent the ship was being blown sideways. The pilot couldn't manage to steer the ship in the direction they wanted to go. The Greek here is very vivid. We were not able to look the wind eye to eye. The ship sails from Fair Havens. A violent storm batters the ship. Paul is told by an angel of God, everyone will survive. After 2 weeks, the ship is shattered against the rocks near Malta. Everyone on board makes it ashore safely. 13 to 44. 16 says, running around the shelter of a small island called Cloda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. This small island, whose modern name is Gavdu, is about 23 miles southwest of Crete. The sheltered side from the storm would have been the southwest side of the island. Once they were in the shelter of the island, they would have had relatively smooth water for 10 or 15 miles, and in this stretch of smooth water, they make what preparations they can for riding out the storm. The ship's boat had been towed astern as was normal practice during good sailing weather. This storm had come up so suddenly they didn't have time to secure the boat. It had been dragged across 20 or 30 miles of storm-tossed sea. It must have been nearly full of water. So Luke and Paul and other prisoners and passengers had the task of hauling on the rope attached to the boat until they dragged it alongside the ship. After the ship's boat was hauled aboard and secured on deck, the next thing to do was undergird the ship. Verse 17 says, after they hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground in the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way were driven along. The one huge mast put a great strain on the hull of those wooden ships, and in a storm like this the timbers would begin to part and the ship would start leaking badly. The undergirding consisting in passing cables under the hull of the vessel and drawing them tight by the capstan. This precaution would help the hull stand the strain and reduce the danger of leaking so badly they would flounder. The desperate haste and the straining efforts required for these operations we could only imagine in those kind of seas. The ship and all aboard were in big trouble now. It was hopeless to try to sail towards Italy, so they battened down the hatches. Roll up the sails, secure the rudders with ropes, tie everything down. They strengthened the bottom of the ship by passing ropes under it to hold it together. Throw out the sea anchors. A sea anchor is like a large underwater parachute that is dragged behind the ship to slow it down, just to try to ride out the storm. There were two celebrated Syrtes along the Mediterranean coasts or shores of North Africa called the Greater and the Lesser. The former lay just west of Cyrene, and the latter was further west near Carthage. There were vast beds of sand driven up by the sea and constantly shifting their position, so it could not be known with certainty where the sandbars were under the surface of the shallow water. These constantly changing sands were terror of all Mediterranean sailors, Josephus says. With storm sails set, with the steering paddles set at 8 points, the strongest rudder possible, when trying to turn the ship towards the wind and keep it off the shallows of Syrtis, they were carried along by the storm. 1819 says, we took such violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their hands. The ship was still taking too much punishment from the storm. Some more precautions were going to have to be taken if we were going to weather out the storm. Through the night and into the next day the violent wind kept blowing, the rain pelted down, and the huge waves continued to batter the ship. The efforts to lighten the ship noted in this verse and the next imply that in spite of the efforts at the undergirding, the ship was leaking and getting heavier with water and in danger of going down. It appeared that the tackling would be in the furniture and the yard arm and the huge wet canvas sails, all things that would be useless in a storm. Verse 20 says, neither sun nor star appeared for many days. No small storm was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. 11 days and nights of wind and rain and waves threatening their lives, followed because of the low dark clouds they couldn't see, the sun by day or the stars by night. In those days, before the invention of the compass, sighting the sun or the stars was the only way sailors had of determining their position. After so many days without a reckoning, the sailors had no idea where they were. It was a great storm. From verse 15 it might appear that the only problem was a high wind. But from this verse we learn the skies were leaden. It was pouring rain. The storm continued day and night without let up. When a ship is beginning to flounder, the usual course of action is to head for the nearest land, run the ship aground and make for shore. Slowly they lost hope. Verse 21, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would have spared yourselves the damage and loss. Without food is a common medical term for loss of appetite. The storm had deprived them of the means, time and inclination to prepare or eat any regular meals. About the time the last man on board was lost hope, Paul stood up one morning with a message of encouragement for his companions in distress. The following narrative implies that while others may have burst into wailing cries of despair and calling, we may believe, like the sailors of Jonah, every man unto his God, Paul opens his word of encouragement and counsel with a firm warning not to dismiss his advice again, like they had back at Fairhavens when at ship's council he had again and again urged them not to try to sail on towards Phoenix. This opening accompanies more than just I told you so. It is calculated to remind them that his advice was good, and this time his advice was based not just on personal experience and observation, but in a message directly from God. The pilot and the captain of the ship and the centurion Julius, we suppose by this time, had formed a much more respected opinion of Paul, and they are prepared to listen to his suggestions this time. The morale of the whole company on the ship was at a dangerously low level. Paul had no news designed to lift their morale or to restore their hope of living through the storm rather than being lost at sea. Verse 22, now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. His calm assurance as he spoke must have been as cheering as the news he had to share with those who had given up all hope. In the next verse he explains the source of his predicted information. This is one of the places in the New Testament where the miraculous is woven right into the warp and woof of historical events. There's no way to remove the appearance of the angel from the account and leave the account whose elements are still coherent and fully explainable. Verse 23 says, for this very night an angel of the God of whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. It was the 12th or 13th night they'd been at sea in the storm. Paul here gives the authority behind his specific prediction about no loss of life but loss of the ship. The God to whom I belong. Paul had identified the source of his message, or the angels might have thought the messenger, like Mercury, was intended. Not so. Paul identifies the source of his revelation as Yahweh, the one creator worshipped by Paul and other Christians. Paul's life of devotion and service would explain why the angel appeared to him and not to others in the ship. The word serve is similar to Romans 1:9 and suggests that some on board have seen Paul at regular devotions. Verse 24 and 25, do not be afraid. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore keep up your courage, men, for I believe that it will turn out exactly as I told you. The angel represents the substance of the promise formerly given to Paul by Jesus. Stand is the proper word for standing before a judge. Since Paul has promised that he will be tried before Caesar, it must be that he will not perish at sea. Not only would Paul himself live through the spell on the sea to stand before Caesar, but the lives of all those on board the ship were to be spared for his sake. The world has no idea how much it owes to the mercy of God in the presence of righteous men in its midst. For 10 righteous men, Sodom would have been spared. For the sake of an apostle needed to bear his testimony before Caesar, 276 soldiers, sailors and passengers were to be spared. Keep up your courage, men. Note how the messenger of God has exactly the needed measure of light and hope, and that too when things seem darkest. Having received a revelation from God through the angel, Paul was completely assured it would happen just as he had been told. He had complete confidence that God would do what he promised he would do. Paul had long ago learned that when God makes a prophecy, it's matched by its fulfillment. Must, because that's the way God is appointed to be. Run aground is the same word used here in verse 17. Verse 26 says, but we must run aground on a certain island. But when the 14th night came, as we had been driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. The statement clearly was part of the message of the angel had spoken to Paul, though in Paul's report it is separated from other things. The angel said, by Paul's affirmation of belief, that God would do as he had promised. The ship would go down, the angel had said, but the men would be saved, washed ashore in some island or other. No easy escape was promised. This element of prediction must have been part of the angel's message, for there was no way the men had any idea of where they were. The last they knew, they were headed towards the mainland of Africa. The island will be Malta. 27. The 14th night had come. The time is reckoned from their leaving fair havens, and verse 18 and 19. The Adriatic Sea here spoken of is central Mediterranean. This is learned from several sources in extant ancient literature. Ptolemy speaks of the Adria as washing the south coast of the Peloponnesus, Greece, and the east coast of Sicily. The ears of the sailors were alive to the sound of the breakers before the passengers whaled them. If they threw out a sea anchor as they left Claudia, it may have struck bottom, which would give the sailors a warning they were nearing land. After they headed ship towards the northwest, in an effort to keep them from being driven from Crete into Cyprus, they were driven across that stretch of open sea by the northeast winds in 14 days. They took soundings, verse 28 says, and found 20 fathoms, and a little further on took another sounding, and found to be 15 fathoms. Still caught in the storm, but now being blown northwest towards Italy, the sailors sensed the approaching land. To take a sounding, they made use of a line with a lead weight at the end of it. They would have heaved the lead line into the rope into the depths to learn how much water was underneath them. Usually there were knots in the rope, each a fathom apart. They learned was 120 feet of water where they were. The Greek rendered fathoms literally means the distance from fingertip to fingertip when the arms are outstretched, including the chest, or about 6 feet. The leadsman would measure the lines. They took it in by grasping and pulling it to arm's length, grasping again and pulling another arm's length of rope up from the depths, and so on until the whole length was retrieved. Verse 29 says, fearing we might run across aground somewhere in the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. The soundings were proof that a shore was nearby, and the sound of the breakers indicated the area was rocky. There was danger they would go aground because of some hidden reef of rock. They feared if they permitted the ship to drift any further, so when they knew they were about 90 fathoms, they dropped the anchors to keep them in this depth of water until daylight came and they could better ascertain their situation. Ancient ships were usually anchored from the bow, but occasionally often demanded that they be anchored as well from the stern, so ships were actually built with hawse holes apt to fit them for anchoring from the stern. They are near land. They can hear the waves crashing into the rocks. They are afraid to be driven into the rocks. Verse 30 says, but as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretence of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, their fears aroused by the breakers and leaky condition of the ship aroused their instincts for self-preservation. The sailors, perhaps even the pilot, the captain included, had figured out a way to save themselves, perhaps at the expense of all the other people on the ship. They're all going to get into the ship's boat and row towards the side of the breakers. That way they will avoid drowning in deeper water. They were already lower in the boat, the one they had earlier hoisted aboard, and were prepared to board it when Paul stopped them. The boat, they could argue, was necessary to the purpose, as they intended to run the anchors out to the end of their cables before they dropped them into the sea. Verse 31, then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. If the ship's officers were themselves involved in the plan to escape, they too were blocked. For Paul went to the centurion Julius, the highest ranking authority in the ship, and warned him that if the sailors were successful in their plan to escape, and Paul's promise of safety to all would no longer be true. Landsmen, like the soldiers and prisoners, would be quite unequal to the task of handling so large a ship under such critical conditions. Here's another time in Paul's life when he refuses to be presumptuous. By this time the centurion had learned it was unwise to disregard Paul's advice, though it's not certain that his advice was correctly interpreted when the soldiers cut the hawsers and let the dinghy fall into the water and drift away. Verse 33 to 34, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. One way to break attention was the means Paul used. Soldiers and sailors need something that will draw them together after what they've just gone through. The food will not only serve as a source of energy for the task for the next morning, but will get their minds off something besides the treachery of the sailors. Constant suspense suggests that most of the nights were sleepless, as they all anxiously awaited the dawn to see what the new day might bring. Without eating, having taken nothing, seems to suggest they missed their regular meals. There was hard work ahead when daylight came, and if it all to come through safely to land, they would need all the energy, enthusiasm, and cooperation they could muster. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We picture Paul himself going to the galley and getting some food to distribute to those who refused to follow his suggestion to get some for themselves. Before he passed it out, he paused to offer thanks to God for the food. Paul himself would teach in another place that prayers of thanksgiving are to be offered at mealtime. Paul asked the soldiers and the sailors to listen to the prayer of thanks for the food to strengthen their bodies. Paul's hearty cheerfulness, his encouragement, his own example has begun to communicate itself to the others on board the ship. We presume that Luke has helped distribute the food that Paul has to offer thanks over. Verse 37 says, all of us in the ship were 276 persons. We also presume that it had to be rationed out to make sure everyone on board could get a fair share. That's probably why Luke has a number of people on board at this point, rather than a close where he says we all got safely to land. Josephus tells us there were 600 people on board the ship on which he set sail for Italy, and which 2 went down at the Sea of Adria. Verse 38, when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. As long as there was hope of saving the ship, they had tried to save the portion of cargo too. But as is done in all cases where it becomes necessity to choose between saving the people on board or saving the ship, they now are prepared to run the ship aground in order to save the people. That required getting as light as possible, so it drew as little water as possible. It's no easy task to raise sacks of grain from the hold of a ship, where many of them were waterlogged, and dump them overboard. But the storm was still raging, and the ship must have been pitching and tossing. Verse 39 says, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. St. Paul's Bay, the traditional site of the wreck, was about 10 miles west of the main harbour of Velita. The bay itself has no marked features by which even a native coming can recognize it. A little bay with a level sandy beach. The word translated beach means a level or pebbly or sandy beach, as opposed to a highly rugged coast. To run the ship to ground, their object was no longer to save the ship from being destroyed, but to save the crew from drowning. Verse 40 says, cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. The anchors were of no further value, and even if they could have been recovered in spite of the continuing storm, they would have added weight, the very thing they have spent the early morning hours getting rid of, as they emptied the grain into the sea. When they put out the anchors, the 2 big paddle runners had been hoisted up and lashed fast, lest they should foul the anchor lines at the stern. Now, when the use was absolutely necessary to steer the ship towards the beach, the lashings by which they had been held up out of the water were loosened, and the paddles fell back into the water. The little foresail would give enough movement through the water so the rudders could steer the ship. Verse 41, but the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bows stuck fast and wouldn't move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. From the mouth of the bay, the little island looks to be a part of the island of Malta, but actually it's separated by a narrow channel about 100 yards in width. The waters coming through this narrow channel meet the waters flowing into St. Paul's Bay from the mouth of the bay. And where these 2 seas meet, there's an underwater sandbar, or mud bank. The front part of the ship was stuck in the mud bank, while the stern was still afloat in deeper water and exposed to the force of the currents and the waves rolling up the storm. As the ship began to break apart, the entire crew and passengers would have to crowded to the forepart. Verse 42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. We've seen, according to tradition, Roman discipline, the soldiers would have to pay the same penalty that the prisoners would receive if the prisoners escaped. In putting the prisoners to death, the soldiers saw what looked like to them like the only opportunity of escaping death themselves. It seems unbelievable that the soldiers could plan to kill Paul, along with others, after he'd been instrumental in saving their lives. But human lives are cheap, and men can be ruthless and cruel when they have power over others. Verse 43 says, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who would swim to jump overboard first and get to land. He felt too grateful to Paul to expose him to such a fate. Again we see that for the sake of one righteous man, the lives of all the prisoners were spared. The centurion has a plan which will prevent any of the prisoners from swimming away and escaping. He orders any of the soldiers who can swim to dive in and make for the shore. Once at ashore, they can stand watch and round up the prisoners as they in turn made for the shore. Once the prisoners made shore, they would be clamped back into custody. They would have to swim from 1/4 to 1/2 mile from the sandbar to the shore. Verse 44 says, the rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. The ship was breaking up. The floating planks and other large timbers offered a means of getting ashore for those who could not swim. This is exactly what Paul had promised. Ship and cargo were lost, but every person on board lived through the shipwreck. The soldiers would have perished if the sailors had gotten away with their selfishness. The prisoners would have died if the soldiers had not been stopped in their plan. The centurion believed Paul and refused to allow any harm to come to them. So God saved all the passengers and crew, because Paul was among them. This has been a long, eventful voyage, and Paul still has not made it to Rome. God has taken care of Paul and given the lives of all those on board the ship from Alexandria. Ellis Jones in his poem says, "A hope of the anchor of the soul," based on Hebrews chapter 6 verse 19. This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, the one which enters within the veil, a New American Standard says. Hope is an anchor of the soul, ties me to heaven's shore. Stormy winds may o'er me roll, the winds may beat and roar. On rough waters I can walk, for he will hold my hand, because I listen to his talk and follow each command. The anchor line may twist and stretch, my strength be almost gone, but because he saved this wretch, he helps me to hold on. If my ship of life goes down, earth's treasures will be gone, but I'll receive a golden crown, he helps me to hang on. To his harbour safe he brings, for I shall drift no more. Praise to him, my glad heart sings, I'll reach the heavenly shore. I hope you've appreciated this lesson from the Apostle Paul in surviving the storm. So, if you can, come back and continue next time. Every blessing.